Good evening, everyone. My name is Paul Young. I'm doing a series of videos to kind of highlight government policy, just to kind of put more substance around statements made by the opposition party as well as the ruling government. And this slide deck's only a few slides because I'm going to just highlight the key issues facing things that typically are not discussed by either Thomas Mulcair or Justin Trudeau when it comes to policy. They're really good at basically playing on emotion, but they're little on facts. So this presentation's on infrastructure because it's an area that comes up quite a bit. Most people live in municipalities that are supported by roads, bridges, etc. So that's one of the areas that comes up because of gridlock and different aspects of infrastructure that drives productivity, whether that's movements of goods and services or just people around. So I want to treat this presentation as almost the economics 101 in terms of infrastructure. What is infrastructure? Well, it's the bridges. So when you're driving around the road and you're going over a water, it's a bridge. It's roads, so it's the city streets, it's the highway system, it's the rural roads. It's the wastewater treatment, so when you have a shower, you use your bathroom, wash dishes, you're using water. That water has to be treated through wastewater treatment, and we have stricter regulations. Park and recreation, so when your kids are playing soccer, you're playing baseball, you're shooting some basketball hoops, you're playing ice hockey, you've got cultural facilities where you get different cultural groups together. The government builds these facilities. That's part of infrastructure. Transit. Now this mostly comes into play in bigger municipality areas where you've got subway, light rail systems, or buses. Some smaller areas, when you get out to rural Ontario or even rural Saskatchewan, likely do not have buses. They may have a situation where they have intercity buses that are private, but that's basically your transit. So what is infrastructure gap? This is a big word that you're going to hear used constantly. And basically what that means is the assets themselves that the city owns, and maybe even the federal government, provincial government own, have a life. And the life is X amount of years. So when they talk about infrastructure gap, they're talking about replacement or maintaining those assets in terms of a workable shape. So when you hear a situation where we have a gap, really that means is our life expectancy of those assets is getting pretty old, and we're going to have to start looking at replacement or refurbishing them. That's where you're basically seeing where that money's coming in, because the bulk of the infrastructure assets were built in Canada, a lot of cases between the 50s, 60s, 70s, and into the 80s, right? So they're approaching 35, 50 years old, so slowly they need to be replaced. The other thing too that you need to look at is in terms of things, we've had certain cities that have had phenomenal growth, and with phenomenal growth comes the legacy. So once you get into cities like Mississauga, Vancouver, even Toronto, they basically have scarcity with land, so they don't have the ability to basically keep building to bring in that development fees, and I'll talk about that a little later on, but that drives some of the accessibility to capital and money. It's part of the capital budgeting projects. In Canada, the infrastructure gap is $123 billion. Now this is an estimate based on the Federation of Municipalities, but basically they pulled their members and looked at things and they broke it down. And basically they focus on areas like transportation, which is basically your roads, transit, wastewater facilities, and recreational cultural facilities is where they focus on. This is giving you an example at the government level. Now, most cases people understand really a lot of the revenue at a top level, but a lot of the taxation for income tax all gets collected into one bucket, and that bucket then gets allocated out to pay social programs as well as direct program spending at the federal level, but it's allocated out through transfers. Well, the federal government back in 2008 to 2009 and during the recession created a couple funds. One was the Build Canada Fund to help stimulate the economy through infrastructure spending. The other one was making permanent dedicated funding for transit infrastructure called the gas tax. Subsequently, since 2009, the Build Canada Fund has been extended. The gas tax is permanent. So there is dedicated fund at a federal level. Now, is it enough? well, you'll get different arguments on that the federal government should be spending more on that. But I'll get into more specific details, but this slide's kind of illustrate you the different funds that are available, because the opposition government has a habit of not talking about the funds. They tend to talk about in platitudes. They also tend to talk about less details. Why? Because it's very easy just to show negativity towards the opposition, because you remember they're pandering for votes, so their best way to do things is kind of sell that they're better than the other government. Now, this particular slide you're seeing here is municipal government revenue. Now, I really just wanted you to focus on it. I know it's a little dated. It's about 7-8 years old. However, the ratio is still roughly the same. If you look at user fees and property tax related taxes, they're about 80 to 90% of the government funding. That's still pretty consistent to what you see if you went out and looked at a government financial statement. And I would encourage you to do that. I would encourage you to go out and look at the government's your own municipal government, and look at them, because that information is publicly available. So you can go look at their operational budget, which is their day-to-day operations in terms of public safety, any sort of programs they support at a municipal level. That's their operational budget. The capital budget, which is driven by what you got in terms of cash flow from here, is basically what they made commitments to support their infrastructure, like I said early on. Now, like anything else, municipality has their own local issues. Now, this has nothing to do with the federal government. These are local issues related to either policies that they have to work with the provincial government or their local concerns that they have to deal with. Arbitration is a big issue, and it's a big issue in Ontario. A lot of municipalities, especially rural areas, do not have local police forces. So what they do is they rely on the OPP to basically cover their areas for public safety, for policing. Now, the issues when you're faced with that is the OPP, if they get a arbitration settlement of 8.5% or something, and say it's over 3 years, the municipality has to pick up that cost. So that cost goes in their public safety budget, which means it's less cash that can go into municipalities' budgets in terms of capital or other aspects. So that's something that's never discussed. Kathleen Wynne tends to deflect this in the Ontario level because she's an angry activist, and her only concern is basically to keep elected. She never really understands financial, and you can probably see that if you go watch some of her statements and whatever commitment she says. Pension funding. This is a big issue across the board. OMERS is in one of the areas in Ontario, which is the Ontario Municipal Pension Fund. It's a pension fund too that's in an unfunded state, which means is the governments at the municipal level would have to fund that totally. That would also impact on decisions by governments in terms of their money, in terms of their cash flow, which would then again flow down to capital. Lower development fees. Now, in growth areas of cities, you'll see basically huge channel of money that they'll take from the development fees that they're supposed to be allocating back to infrastructure, and also putting it into reserve funds to be used at a future date. Now, when you get into situations like Mississauga, that basically went through phenomenal growth since the early 1980s, they basically were able to do a lot of things because they had that development fees. Now, since Miss Hazel McCallum, who likes to support Justin Trudeau, who was a wonderful mayor up to a certain point, seems to forget that it's the legacy issues that Mississauga is going to have to deal with now, and these legacy issues go back to some of her decisions or lack of decisions when she started building this city up in terms of infrastructure around transits and roads. So before everybody toots and says that Hazel McCallum is a great mayor, you should also look at the fact is how did she manage the development fees and manage gridlock when she was in control. She's not the only mayor. Brampton's been the same way in other cities. So some of this stuff, the municipal politicians are great, just like provincial, is putting the blame on Harper. What you need to ask yourself is take a holistic view of some of these statements and see what they align with the facts. Downloading of services. This all started from when the federal government cut transfers to the provinces. The provinces then cut money and taxation or other flows to the provinces and forced downloading of social services or other programs. Some of that has been uploaded, but there's still other things that need to be done to help support that. These costs are paid by property tax dollars, which then eats into the ability of those same municipalities to be able to feed into capital budgets. This is just giving you an example of the city of Mississauga of how they're funding their capital budgets. They're relying on the gas tax for a good portion of it. They're also relying on development fees, tax programs, debt tax. So some municipalities will fund debt. Now, what you may hear talk, and Kevin Page brought this up on an interview with Don Martin, is that one of the reasons why they're pushing for the federal government's more involvement is they can technically borrow money at a lower rate, which actually helps on the debentures and the debts for the municipalities. So that's when the discussion is, because we are at low interest rates, that maybe it makes a decision to kind of look at that. So I wanted to bring up that as well, as because it feeds in terms of the debt financing issue. Now I wanted just to show you the gap here. I'm using a 10-year period here, so that if we wanted to fix this over 10 years, we'd have to make a commitment of $12.3 billion. The federal government itself is actually making a commitment to close to $4 billion in infrastructure funding each year. Now, bear in mind with some of these projects are more than 1 year in duration. So even though funding's there, so the way these projects work, they continue on. They still have funding, but the aspect of it is they can carry over a longer period of time. Second thing is, in the past, the municipalities and the provincial government used to match dollar for dollar. So if, for example, if the federal government's giving $3.4 billion in, the municipalities would have to match the $3.4 billion and the province would have to do that. Now, this all comes back to setting priorities. Kathleen Wynne, for example, in Ontario, set the wrong priorities. She felt that it's better to grow the size of government by increasing her private sector or public sector payrolls than put money into infrastructure and transit. Only recently did she decide to do this. And again, you need to be very careful when you start making strategic decisions in procurement processes, because in Ontario's case, they actually have spent $8 billion over on P3s because they do not have a transparent and clear process. So I'm all for investing money in infrastructure, but it has to be the right way, and we have to look at innovative ways to make sure that we expand on those dollars. You're not going to hear those statements from the opposition parties. You won't even hear those statements from the municipalities, because they just want to hold out their hands and they want the money. I think we're in an era now where we should be really pushing these people. There's only one taxpayer. We need to get you guys to run things in an efficient and effective manner. Now, here's the basically policies as of this date. So this video is done September 13, 2015. Bill Canada Gas Tax Fund will be kept by all three parties. The Liberals are the only one that seems to be saying now, and it looks like he's taking a page, Justin Trudeau, of the Kathleen Wynne approach, which is basically spend money on infrastructure. Now, you need to bear in mind with the Liberal government, this is the same Liberal government in the 90s that through austerity measures cut infrastructure money right back and delayed those expenditures to future periods. You will never hear Justin Trudeau talk about that, because he can't win an election on talking about they don't have a historical record in the last 20 years of putting money in. Thomas Mulcair is incoherent with his statements. He talked about something about putting $1.3 billion more into infrastructure over 20 years. But what he didn't say is how much that would be new money. This is typical response by Mulcair. Mulcair typically shoots from the hip. He never really talks in facts. He talks more pandering. And if you confront the guy, he becomes Angry Tom. And you'll see this on a video where he was meeting with Peter Mansbridge when Mansbridge asked him about ISIS, and he basically got really angry with the comment. Mulcair is a pure BS artist, and if people need to kind of go through his statements to make sure how they align with reality. I've done a video on the NDP platform, and you're more than apt to go look at it, because as I said, it clears out exactly where this guy's got funding gaps. And the way I've estimated it, he's got close to a $20 billion funding gap in terms of what he's saying and what he's committed to do. The Conservative Party will consistently keep the Bill Canada, Bill Canada Gas Tax Fund. He is also looking at more work and more funding around transit and transportation systems. He hasn't clearly stated that in his platform yet, but he has been clear that they have funded infrastructure in the past. But the key thing is overall with infrastructure, it is not one option to look at infrastructure. We have to look at everything in total to kind of look at the best way to do it to maximize dollars. And that's the questions you should be asking your elected representatives or your candidates in this upcoming election. Thank you.